Hey everyone, I'm Allison Morris. You're watching NBC News Now. A presidential victory lap in the Rose Garden today. President Biden and Democrats celebrating the American Rescue Plan this afternoon. Biden thanking Democrats in the House and Senate for getting the bill passed, saying we've delivered on the promise that help is on the way. Press Secretary Jen Psaki reiterating President Biden's goal to have small family gatherings on Independence Day.
There will be access to vaccines. They will be eligible. And if they take steps to get vaccinated, to continue to wear masks, to continue to observe social distancing, then looking ahead to July 4th is an aspirational moment where people can plan small get-togethers in their backyard.
Now the work begins getting the $1.9 trillion of relief to the public. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen telling Today co-anchor Savannah Guthrie the price tag meets the country's needs right now.
Have you overshot the mark? Are you spending too much?
I don't believe we've overshot the mark.
We begin this hour with NBC News White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell and NBC News national political reporter Sahil Kapoor. Kelly, today's ceremony kicks off the administration's Help is Here tour. What is President Biden saying about taking his message on the road?
Well, that's the next important phase of this. The legislating is done. His pen has hit the paper. It is now law. And what comes next is a piece that is important for the administration to explain to the public what's in the bill, how they can benefit, how it will work. And there's the implementation part. Just putting numbers in the legislation to say there's this much for vaccines or this much for schools or this much going to individuals and families is not the same as implementing it. And he learned that personally during the Obama administration when he was put in charge of dealing with the big financial package at the time when the economy was in crisis and how to get the new resources out into the country and applied in ways where it's done fairly, appropriately, and without too much waste or abuse. So President Biden today focused on that as he described how this next phase will be critically important for actually making what is a law a tangible benefit to the public. Here's the president.
The devil's in the details. It's one thing to pass the American Rescue Plan. It's going to be another thing to implement it. It's going to require fastidious oversight to make sure there's no waste or fraud and the law does what it's designed to do. And I mean it. We have to get this right. Details matter because we have to continue to build confidence in the American people that their government can function for them and deliver.
A big part of the atmosphere of this Rose Garden event was celebratory, congratulatory. There was effusive praise back and forth. But there you heard from the president the very sort of weathered acknowledgement of someone who's been in government a long time and has been in this kind of position before, that getting it across the finish line is a worthy marker for them to celebrate. This was important for Democrats and the new administration. But President Biden and his team will ultimately be judged by a lot of what comes next, how it gets implemented and how it affects change in terms of lifting people up who've had financial hardship, getting vaccines into people's arms and all the other aspects of this. So we will be talking about the COVID relief plan in this next phase for a while to come. Allison?
Sahil, this also caps off a big week for Democrats on the Hill. Here's Speaker Pelosi celebrating Democratic lawmakers at the White House.
Our diversity is our strength. Our unity is our power. And in this bill, our diversity to protect everyone in our country, to end the disparity in access to everything that the bill presents. Our diversity was reflected in the House and the Senate in that policy. But our unity on behalf of all of the American people is what made this such a triumph.
Sahil, what are Democratic leaders saying about the next big items on their agenda, like infrastructure?
Well, Speaker Pelosi has already moved on a little bit past the COVID bill in terms of legislating. She has passed through the House of Representatives a bill known as H.R. 1, a major expansion in voting rights and various anti-corruption measures. Also this week, the Democratic-led House passed 2 gun control bills that essentially beef up background check requirements and close loopholes in the system. Now, on the other end, the Senate, both of these bills are unlikely to get the 60 votes needed to clear the filibuster and eventually get passed. And there are Democrats in the Senate who prefer to focus on something like infrastructure. There's some hunger to do a package that would increase American competitiveness with China. This is a project by Senator Schumer, the Democratic Majority Leader, that he's been encouraging them to do. So it is a big decision for Democrats in terms of where to go next. Do they bask in the glow of this COVID victory by trying to pursue something smaller and bipartisan, or do they try to raise the temperature a little bit, go big, and try to get some of the more ambitious items in their agenda through? Allison.
Kelly, some Republicans are criticizing President Biden for not giving former President Trump any credit for the COVID vaccines during his address last night. Here's Senator Tim Scott today.
Operation Warp Speed not only produced the vaccine, but because of President Trump's genius, we saw 3 companies that we saw potential in. So we bought 100 million doses at the beginning of this cycle. That means that when President Biden came into office, we were already averaging more than 1 million doses a day.
Kelly, any reaction from the White House to that?
Well, they have been pressed on this issue of, in the spirit of unity that the president talks about a lot, why was there no specific acknowledgement in the national address last night or today about the work of the Trump administration? Now, President Biden has acknowledged it publicly before, earlier in his time in office, that the Trump administration had gotten the ball rolling. But today, Press Secretary Jen Psaki talked about this, saying, while the president in the Trump years, President Donald Trump, did get that started, what he did not do was come up with the plan for how the vaccines would get into people's arms. He did not do enough in terms of supporting mask wearing and so forth. So they're sort of splitting the difference. And at a time when the president is talking about unity and there is some desire to make certain that followers of President Trump do, in fact, get the vaccine, and so that there isn't vaccine hesitance among Republicans in particular, could there have been more done to acknowledge that? The White House was pressed on that today. They're saying that President Biden has acknowledged it in the past and didn't need to do so now. But that will be a message we'll continue to hear from Republicans who think that the Trump administration deserved more credit. And certainly there was a statement put out by the former president himself, of course, claiming credit in a very Trumpian style, that he says there would not have been vaccines available now if not for him. So it's very much through the lens of how you vote and how you view these things, where you think the credit should go for all of this. Allison?
Absolutely, Kelly. Sahil, there are bipartisan calls to reduce security around the Capitol. Senate Republicans sending a letter to Capitol Police about the fencing today. The leaders of the House Armed Services Committee saying they are deeply troubled by the current level of security. What, if any, changes could come from this?
There is growing consternation, Allison, among lawmakers in both parties as to whether this highly elevated level of security around Capitol Hill, where it was just hours ago, is necessary. There's massive amounts of fencing. There are roads blocked off. You have to walk from several blocks away in order to get to the Capitol. And the building is simply closed to ordinary visitors, which is a major change. Senate Republican leaders wrote a letter saying that this is a departure from what American citizens are used to, and it sends a terrible message to them. They said it's entirely unclear to them why the fencing around the Capitol remains. And in the House of Representatives, the top Democrat and top Republican on the House Armed Services Committee declared quite, simply, this present security posture is not warranted at this time, quote unquote. They talk about the financial cost associated with a prolonged deployment, and they say they shouldn't turn a blind eye to the effects that it will have on the National Guard's overall readiness to have so many of them stationed at the Capitol. So we'll see where this goes. But the bottom line is there's a difference between Capitol Police who ordered an extension of that deployment and received it, and lawmakers in both parties who say, what are you doing?
Sahil, Kelly, thank you both so very much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
You too.
The first stimulus checks will hit American bank accounts this weekend. But what about the rest of the funding from the American Rescue Plan? And how will we pay for it? Today, co-host Savannah Guthrie asked Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen in an NBC News exclusive interview.
So this massive bill is now signed into law. Some estimates up to $475 billion of the last relief packages still hasn't been spent. So how are you going to make sure that this money gets out fast, not just the direct payments, to the people who really need it?
We're working hard first to get the direct payments out, the $1,400 checks or direct deposits. Americans will begin seeing those show up in their bank accounts this weekend. There's payments for rental assistance for homeowners in trouble. There'll be money to support vaccinations, money for state and local governments to open schools. We will also work to get this money out as quickly as possible. Not all of it will be spent this year, but a good chunk of it, and into next year, it'll provide a lot of relief.
You and the president have made the argument that this is a time to go big or go home. That being said, even some progressive economists say this stimulus is up to 3 times bigger than it needs to be. Have you overshot the mark? Are you spending too much?
I don't believe we've overshot the mark. I think that this package is the right size. We put it together by asking, what are the needs of Americans? Where do we need to get money and how much to relieve all the suffering that's occurring in the economy? When the pandemic struck, the unemployment rate was 3.5%, and I'd like to see us get back there next year. And I think if all goes well with the vaccination program, there's a good chance of accomplishing that. The
Congressional Budget Office, which is independent, says the economy is right now about 3% below its potential. So that's $600 or $700 billion. We're about to spend $1.9 trillion. And it's almost like if you had a headache before and you took one aspirin, you knew that wasn't good enough, but that doesn't mean next time you take the whole bottle. Is it just far too big with temporary fixes that don't address those underlying problems?
Well, this is a package that addresses the pandemic and helps people get to the other side intact. We don't want to have people be scarred by long spells of unemployment, being out of the labor market because children can't go to school. We want to get the economy back operating in a normal way. And then we do have long-run challenges to address, and we're preparing to do that.
Every American watching knows there's no such thing as a free lunch. Do you expect taxes to be raised in the first term to pay for some of these priorities in this big bill that has just been signed into law?
We did not propose any tax increases in this bill. I think America has enough fiscal space to be able to afford this relief that Americans need. When we tackle longer run priorities and longer term investments, we'll look at ways to fund those projects later on.
So it sounds like maybe yes in the future for other priorities.
For other priorities, yes.
Hospitality, retail, and entertainment all hit hard by this pandemic, but there are some industries thriving during COVID and even small businesses that are taking off. Among them, home remodeling. NBC business and technology correspondent Jolene Kent went to Las Vegas to find out why.
When COVID-19 first hit, the heart of Las Vegas became a ghost town.
Some big new projects were put on pause because these tourists who normally fuel the economy here on the Strip, they simply stopped showing up.
It's been frustrating because you've seen projects that are ready to go and people just hold on to them for a little bit.
While commercial construction is facing an uncertain future, residential spending is soaring, skyrocketing more than 20% compared to this time last year.
In nearby suburban Henderson, remodeling is literally through the roof for project managers like Chris Gordy.
What's in demand?
Kitchens and full home remodels, kind of like what you see now, larger projects. I think that a lot of people are kind of sitting around right now and just staring at their homes, and they're not traveling. They have this extra money to be spent, and this is what they want to invest in.
Gordy and business owner Brett Primack are grateful for the unexpected boom.
When the pandemic hit, what went through your head?
So March 18th was our doomsday. It was, for me, one of the hardest days of our business life.
But after the initial shock, everything changed.
I was kind of shy at first to tell people that we were doing okay. We ended up having a record year in 2020, which for us is amazing. We beat the previous year by 10%.
Wow. These days, they can't hire fast enough.
I mean, I'm always hiring.
Another obstacle, raw materials.
What are some of the products that are hard to source?
Cabinets right now. Cabinets for us has been probably our number one challenge. There's a problem with supply chain all the way across that is going to keep on affecting us, I think, for many months to come.
But it's a small price to pay.
What's been the best part of all of this for you?
Honestly, to be able to just keep people on board, not have to lay people off, not have to do that was a huge relief.
Time to check in with NBC News Now correspondent Simone Boyce. She has the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Hi, Simone.
Hey, Allison, we start with some tech news. Lobbyists for Facebook and Google are fighting new legislation here in the U.S. that would make it harder for the companies to use news content to drive traffic and revenue without paying the publishers. Both Google and Facebook declined to comment on that legislation. Well, in Guatemala, the Mexican government returned the bodies of 16 Guatemalans who were massacred in Mexico near the U.S. border. A woman arrested and another has turned herself in after they assaulted an Uber driver in San Francisco who asked one of them to put on a mask during their ride. A third woman was in the car but is not a suspect at the moment. Police say this incident is still under investigation. And over in Brooklyn, a statue of the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was unveiled today, just days before Ginsburg would have turned 88 on March 15th. Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams has declared the 15th Justice Ginsburg Day. And a little bit of news out of Hollywood. The Grammys are this Sunday, but R&B singer of the Weeknd is boycotting music's biggest night because he says his latest album and his hit single, Blinding Lights, were snubbed. Now, multiple artists are hopping on that bandwagon and calling out the Recording Academy, including Nicki Minaj, Zayn Malik, and Tiana Taylor. Allison, we know that there have been several complaints about the Grammys and their voting process and diversity and inclusion within the Recording Academy over the past few years, so I'm sure this is not the end of it.
Yeah. Simone, I just got to ask, I mean, if that album is not, if Blinding Light is not up for an award, I mean, what is? Come on. Everyone was rocking out to that this year. Give me a break.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. That was kind of my soundtrack to 2020, for sure.
It helped get us through. Simone, thank you, and have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah. Thanks, girl. You too.
Alabama having trouble balancing its COVID vaccine distribution. Parts of the state have a surplus, while many of the state's poorest counties are begging for more. NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber spent the last few days traveling across Alabama's Black Belt region. She joins me now from Selma. Ellison, you're outside Rural Health Medical Program's Selma Clinic, where I understand they just got their first doses of the vaccine this week and started administering the J&J vaccine today. Would you tell us about some of the challenges they are up against there?
Yeah, I mean, the hurdles for any medical clinic or hospital throughout Alabama's Black Belt are really enormous. These are, in the Black Belt region, these are some of the poorest counties in the entire state. They do not have great access to health care, and these counties were hit hardest by COVID-19 over the summer. They had some of the highest death rates per capita because of COVID-19, and also some of the highest rates of infection per capita because of COVID-19. Let me show you this little bit of an image that's on the side of this medical mobile unit. I'll explain more to you why this is relevant in a minute, but just to start with, to give you some context of the challenges they face here. So Rural Health Medical Program has 8 different clinics in 5 counties in the Black Belt. Wilcox County, that is the poorest county in Alabama. Perry, second poorest county in Alabama. So of these 8 clinics, they did not have a single clinic that was able to get the Pfizer vaccine because not one of them had those special freezers you need in order to have the Pfizer vaccine, and they couldn't afford to buy one. Those cost on average somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000. So then they went to their next option and they tried to get the Moderna vaccine. They did not get that, and they still have not gotten that. But as they were looking through, they realized they had 3 out of their 8 clinics that had enough generators necessary to potentially support the Moderna vaccine. But their application to get those vaccines is still pending. Then this week, they finally caught a break. They got approved for 200 doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. They arrived here in Selma a couple of days ago. And just now, today, in March, they were able to finally start vaccinating some of their staff. This is a story that we've heard from other clinics, other small rural areas around here, where it is really challenging for them to just have access to basic things. And when you layer in the pandemic to begin with, all of that gets a lot harder. Money doesn't come easy here, whether you are a doctor's office, big or small, and they're working through a lot of hurdles and within a lot of really difficult parameters when money is something they have to factor in. Allison?
Ellison, it's just unbelievable to hear what they've been through there. We've seen mass vaccination sites across the U.S., some specifically set up to reach underserved communities. Why isn't that happening in Alabama's Black Belt?
So one of the things rural medical health program is hoping that they can do is that they can turn this mobile medical clinic, which has actually currently been used as an optometry clinic, into a vaccination clinic on wheels. The reason why something like a big mass vaccination site doesn't necessarily work in these areas is because people really live very far away and very spread out. And a mass vaccination clinic might work well for a suburban area or a city where people can drive, they have the time, they have access to transportation to get where they need. That's not the case in many of these Black Belt counties. But listen to some of what we've heard as we've traveled from Selma, which is in the eastern side of Alabama's Black Belt, to the middle of it and all the way out west towards Mississippi.
Help is going to be needed, and I think it needs to be proactive like it is, because when the door is open for more people who's outside of the criterion right now for getting the vaccine is open, we won't have the capacity to do it by ourselves. The hospital won't.
As far as the supply, I can say that it started off very promising, but there are still facilities now that I'm in communication with that have completed the prerequisites with the Department of Public Health that have still not received shipments.
Sometimes I think the lens that has to be changed is, instead of allocating based off of population, is to allocate based off of need. Because you know what will always happen? The Black Belt will always be without, because our population hasn't changed. And even when we're on an incline, the population will still be far less than a Montgomery or a Birmingham.
Why do you So county after county, there are dozens of counties in Alabama's Black Belt, over a dozen counties. They are doing the best that they can. And some, like a doctor we spoke to in Perry County, the only doctor in that county, by the way, he said that things are going a lot better than he expected. And also, he was really surprised that so many people, probably because they have been so harshly impacted by this virus, have been eager to get the vaccine when they're able to. But it's not easy given the distance, given the lack of money, given the lack of staff a lot of these places have to get people vaccinated at the level they want to see people getting vaccinated at. And as vaccine eligibility expands, what we've heard from doctors, nurses, hospital and health administrators is that that's going to be a lot harder and that they will need more help, because at some point they'll be forced to make a decision of, do they do the normal medical care and normal doctor office visits that people need, or vaccinate? And it will have to be one or the other, because they simply don't have enough staff to do it both, to do it all. Yeah. Allison?
Allison, we know this part of Alabama has been really hard hit. Black Belt counties have had some of the highest COVID positivity rates in the state. So how does the state work to close this gap? How do they get everyone in Alabama vaccinated, given the challenges that you've just told us about?
Yeah, so the state says that they are going to start sending Alabama National Guard members, deploy them to some 20-plus locations in rural Alabama, including in parts of the Black Belt, to help with vaccination efforts starting March 23rd. The question, though, that some people we've spoken to have is, what does that look like? They welcome that move and they want that help, but they also say, given the small communities here, how isolated things are, and how some people, maybe they can't afford always to spend gas money to drive into the main town. It's kind of a food, or do I drive to get a vaccine situation for many families, that they really need to work very closely with local groups to make sure that they're going into the pockets of these communities and getting the vaccine to the most vulnerable people. Now, one bit of news or number that is positive this week is the Alabama Department of Health says that 20% of people living in Alabama's Black Belt have been vaccinated as of Wednesday. But again, you go back to all those other factors we talked about, the really low amount of resources available here in terms of access to health care, the fact that these counties are the poorest in Alabama, and that their population was hit so hard and so vulnerable to severe cases of COVID-19, that all of that makes it more important that those numbers are really, really high here. And people we've spoken to say that 20% level is just not enough when you consider how vulnerable these communities are. Allison?
Sure. Yeah, Ellison Barber in Selma, thank you so much for your reporting. Look for the helpers. The saying is Mr. Rogers, but it applies to this next story perfectly. Vernetta Price is just that, a helper. Scheduling, driving, she does it all, making sure that her neighbors get the COVID-19 vaccine. And she's not stopping until her rural Mississippi community is protected. NBC News Now correspondent Priscilla Thompson has her story.
Retired school teacher Vernetta Price is still driving carpool, except now her riders are a little older and they're not heading to school.
Okay, you all ready?
Price has a new calling, getting neighbors in her small rural town of Sardis, Mississippi, vaccinated.
What side you want to get the shot on? I want to make sure people are safe in my area. I want to go back to church and just have a normal life.
When Price isn't giving rides, she's booking appointments.
You're scheduled for Panola County Basil Civic Center, Thursday, March 11, 2021 at 12:20.
Since January, she's signed up more than 80 people for their vaccine appointments, visiting the state webpage up to 30 times a day.
You nervous? Oh, okay. I've had it. Don't worry about it. You'll be okay.
Price has lived in Sardis for nearly 30 years, raising 4 kids in the tiny town of just over 1,800 people. But now she says it feels like anything but home.
My daughter-in-law had COVID. That was in July, and she's still having symptoms. I had a friend whose parents, both are deceased now from COVID. And a great friend, a minister, recently died of COVID. So it has really impacted me tremendously.
Panola County has one of the highest per capita rates of COVID infections in all of Mississippi and in the predominantly black Delta region. Plus, there's another problem.
Mississippi has one of the worst racial disparities in terms of vaccine distribution of any state in the country. Why do you think that is?
The rural area, people not able to know how to sign up, because several of my church members were saying, we're waiting for them to call us, the health department. Because if they're waiting for them to call them, then they're not going to get the vaccination.
Lack of reliable internet and access to transportation have crippled vaccination efforts in parts of rural Mississippi. So Price answered the call, breaking down barriers to ensure all of her neighbors get their shots.
Got my car today.
In the hopes that one day soon, her community can feel like home again.
How long do you plan to keep this up?
I hope once I get through with the elderly, I get to the young people. And as long as it takes, as long as it takes. Tell them call me. I'll sign them up today. I'm ready.
While some Latino churches are pushing to get their parishioners vaccinated, others are struggling to stop the spread of misinformation. NBCNews.com reporting that health experts now worry these false claims are creating vaccine hesitancy in Hispanic communities, a population COVID is already hitting pretty hard. NBC News Latino reporter Carmen Cecine joins me now. Carmen, you write that Latino churches are like a double-edged sword when it comes to vaccination efforts. Tell us what you mean there.
Absolutely. So most churches are doing the correct thing and actually educating people about the vaccine and helping their congregants get vaccinated, even on site at their churches. But there's a small but significant number of churches that are doing quite the opposite. They're spreading disinformation. So many of them are telling their congregants to stay away from the vaccine, telling them that it's going to alter their DNA, that the vaccine contains a microchip and it's going to allow the government to track them, or that fetal tissue was used to form the vaccine. I spoke to a pastor when I was doing my research who told me, well, you know, the virus was actually developed in 2015 after a group of world leaders visited Wuhan. You know, obviously an absolute false claim, but these are the kind of things that are going on. You have churches that are helping vaccinate people, and then you have others that are spreading disinformation. Allison?
It seems like a lot of these claims are spreading online more so than in actual churches. Tell us more about the role social media is playing here and how church leaders are combating that.
Right. So a lot of these pastors are seeing the information on social media, just like a lot of other people are. They're seeing posts on Facebook, on Twitter, a lot of YouTube videos describing this disinformation. The pastors see this and they believe it, and they go to the church and they talk about it with their congregants, and they believe that they're doing the right thing. They believe the vaccine is bad and that they're helping their congregants. But then you have another aspect, which is some pastors are interpreting the virus and the vaccine as the apocalypse from the book of Revelation. So they believe that the vaccine is the mark of the beast. And this is, just the beginning of the end of the world. So you have a combination of things going on at churches as far as the disinformation. Allison?
Latinos are almost 2.5 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than white Americans, according to the CDC. They're also more than 3 times as likely to be hospitalized. What are pastors and church leaders doing to encourage vaccine enrollment?
Right. So a lot is actually being done. The state of Florida, for example, where many of these churches are, have begun to vaccinate people at Latino churches. You have the Association of Hispanic Ministers of South Florida that includes hundreds of churches that are working with Jackson Memorial Hospital, Miami's public hospital, to get vaccines to their congregants. So sometimes it's very challenging for people to go online and get vaccines. So what they do is they come up with a list of all the people that need to get vaccinated. They give it to the hospital, and the hospital contacts the people with the appointments, and they get vaccinated. You also have the National Latino Evangelical Coalition that includes over 6,000 pastors across the country, and they've taken it upon themselves to make PSAs, release PSAs. They've been holding webinars with Health and Human Services, with the CDC, to answer people's questions. A lot of people have legitimate questions, but sure, a lot of experts worry that this is leading to vaccine hesitancy among Latinos. According to the Kaiser Family Institute, 36% of Hispanics say they will definitely get vaccinated in comparison to 46% of non-Latino whites. So that worries a lot of people. Allison?
Yeah. Carmen, a really important story. Thanks for coming on to talk about it with us.
Thank you, Allison.
May 1st, that's when the White House wants every American adult to be eligible for a vaccine. Here's how the COVID response team plans to get those shots into as many arms as possible.
Up to 700 new community health centers coming online, a doubling of pharmacy locations, and a surge in vaccinators. We're ensuring that equity remains at the center of our response. The administration is expanding the pool of qualified professionals who will be able to administer shots. And so this list now includes dentists, optometrists, paramedics, physician assistants, and many more, including trained medical and healthcare students.
Joining me now, Dr. Julie Morita, Executive Vice President of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, started by one of the founders of Johnson & Johnson. Dr. Morita, President Biden saying by Independence Day, we could be having barbecues, small gatherings with friends if this goes right. Based on what we heard there from Dr. Nunez-Smith, do you think we have enough resources to meet that 4th of July goal?
Hi, Allison. Nice to see you again. Yeah, I think it's there's good reasons to be hopeful. Really hopeful about this. What we see is that the vaccine rates of administration are actually rising already. And we have over 2 million doses per day that are being administered. And almost 20% of the populations are actually receiving 1 or more doses of the vaccine. So we're making huge strides. And then on top of that, with the American Rescue Plan, there's additional resources that will be flowing to actually support vaccination. And the beautiful thing about it is it's not just flowing generally, but it's also flowing into communities that have been really hard hit by the pandemic in the past. And so these pop-up clinics will be increasing. Retail pharmacies will have more vaccines. More of the public clinics will have vaccines, and more mobile units will actually be able to take vaccines into these communities. So I'm, as a public health person, always a little wary. So I'd say I'm cautiously optimistic that if we get these systems up and going, that we actually will be able to vaccinate a lot of people and actually get into the communities that need it the most.
Dr. Nunez-Smith talked about that, saying the White House really wants to make sure marginalized communities aren't left behind. What specifically would you like to see health officials doing on that front to be sure that does not happen?
Well, we know that with the pandemic that African American, Hispanic, Native Americans have actually been really hit hard, and more of them have been hospitalized and have died as a result of the pandemic. So it's really important that the health officials reach into those communities and work with community organizations. Some of the stories that you shared earlier show faith organizations helping, other community members stepping up to really reach out to the communities, to bring the vaccines to communities, help them make appointments because they can't necessarily have access to the computer or into high-speed internet access, making sure the clinics are actually scheduled on weekends or after hours or before work days so people can actually make it to the appointments. Those things are really, really essential on top of having the vaccines available in the geographies where people are located.
During the COVID-19 response team briefing, Dr. Fauci talked about monoclonal antibody treatments, saying they're really effective. Listen here.
The results were really dramatic. There was 100% protection against symptomatic infection in the group compared to placebo, and it reduced the overall infection rate by 50%. And importantly, those who were infected had 100-fold lower viral load and shorter duration of detectable viral RNA.
Dr. Morita, as people are waiting for their vaccines and could potentially be exposed and get sick from COVID, what should they know about monoclonal antibodies as a COVID treatment should they get sick? To whom are these available? How do you get them? What should we know here?
The monoclonal antibodies are yet another tool in the toolbox to help people if they get sick with COVID. I think there's antiviral medications that have been used as well. Some people are using steroid therapy as well in critically sick patients. So the monoclonal antibodies are a tool that are available. They're not broadly available right now. And so it kind of depends on where you live and if there is access to those particular treatments. I think a key thing to keep in mind is that there's things that we can do when we're not vaccinated that will help us keep us safe. So even if you haven't been vaccinated, wearing a mask, washing your hands, avoiding crowds, and social distancing, all those kinds of things are really, really important so you don't end up in the hospital requiring therapy. It's better to prevent the infection than have to think about the treatment aspect.
Some viewer questions for you, if you don't mind. What do we know about how well the COVID vaccines work for people who are immunocompromised? Do they offer the same level of protection?
So the interesting thing about these particular vaccines that we have, the Pfizer, the Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, none of those vaccines are actually live vaccines. And so people who have who are immunocompromised or who don't have normal immune systems can actually receive those vaccines. Some vaccines like chickenpox vaccine or measles vaccines are live, though they're attenuated and weakened. So people that are immunocompromised can't get them. But these vaccines can be received by people who are immunocompromised. The number of people who were enrolled in studies to look at how effective the vaccines were was really small, and because they weren't really intentionally enrolled in these studies. So there's a potential that the vaccines may not work quite as well as they do with someone with a normal immune system. However, there's likely to be some benefit, so it's a good idea to get vaccinated.
Another viewer question for you. If someone got their second Moderna vaccine a month ago, but they're still not showing any antibodies, does that mean they are not protected?
So I think a key thing to do is that there's no recommendation right now to have your antibody tested after you get vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And so the studies that have been done have really shown that people have good immune responses after their second dose about 2 weeks afterwards. And so at this point, if someone's received 2 doses of the vaccine and they've waited 2 weeks, they should consider themselves protected.
Dr. Morita, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for coming back to see us.
Thank you. Take care.
Activists and locals coming together in Louisville today to remember Breonna Taylor a year after her death. Police shot and killed the 26-year-old emergency room technician in her own apartment while serving a no-knock warrant. NBC News correspondent Antonia Hilton is in Louisville. Antonia, there's so much hurt, so much anger a year after Breonna's death. How are folks there remembering her today?
Well, Allison, behind me here, you can see that a small crowd has gathered at Jefferson Square Park. And this is the central meeting place for activists and supporters of Breonna Taylor's family, and it has been from the very beginning. There's a small group here tonight, but tomorrow at this same location, we're expecting some of the largest crowds the city has seen in months, demonstrating in Breonna's honor. And what we're hearing from residents is that they want to keep Breonna Taylor's memory alive. The city has come and barricaded areas downtown so that people can come gather in large numbers safely and stay here throughout the entire day, potentially into the evening. People here say that they're grateful that some reforms have passed over the last year, but that ultimately that hurt and anger comes from the fact that nobody has been charged with Breonna Taylor's killing or held responsible for causing her death. And until that happens, residents say that justice hasn't been served, Allison.
Her mom, activists want the officers involved to be arrested. A year later, how likely are charges in this case? And could you also tell us about the city's policing reforms since Breonna Taylor's death?
So, Allison, it's a complicated question. Right now, there is a federal investigation that's ongoing, and so developments could come out of that. And now Breonna Taylor's family is also calling on the local Commonwealth attorney to pick up the mantle and to try to bring charges against the officers himself. Now, in the past, he has said that there is a potential conflict of interest there, and so it's unclear if he'll actually follow those calls for him to take action now. In terms of reform, there have been a number of reforms that have happened, most notably Breonna's law passed here in the city. So there's a ban on no-knock warrants here now. And then there's also changes in requirements around the use of body cameras when officers execute search warrants. But when you talk to folks here, what you hear from them consistently is that those reforms don't go nearly far enough in terms of ensuring that there's never going to be a case like Breonna Taylor's ever again. I talked about this with David James just a couple hours ago right here. He is the president of the Louisville Metro Council, and he's now a candidate for mayor here in Louisville. Take a listen to what he had to say about the question of accountability and healing.
I don't think we're at square one. I think we're inching towards that trust. But it's going to take time. It's going to take a long time. Because, again, we didn't get here overnight. And so it's going to take a long time for the trust with the police department to be built. And it's not going to be built by policies alone. It's going to be built by actions. And so the community is going to have to see the actions of the police chief, the actions of the mayor, the actions of the council, and how the actions of the police officers relating to the citizens plays out in real life.
James is now running for mayor, and so I asked him point blank, if you become the mayor, are you going to be inheriting a very divided city? And he told me unequivocally, yes, Allison.
Antonia Hilton in Louisville, a year after Breonna Taylor's death. Thank you so much. $27 million. That's the price tag in the settlement between George Floyd's family and the city of Minneapolis in a wrongful death lawsuit. This afternoon, Philonise Floyd thanks supporters and protesters for putting their lives on the line for his brother.
Even though my brother is not here, he's here with me in my heart. Because if I could get him back, I will give all of this back. I want to be able to thank all the supporters, all the protesters for standing, especially during a pandemic where you didn't have to.
Yes.
You put your lives on the line.
Yes.
There's nothing I can do to be able to repay you for that.
NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster joining me now from Minneapolis. Shaq, this $27 million settlement is a record payout, according to the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. How did they reach this deal, and what are local officials saying about it?
Well, we learned about this settlement this morning in a city council meeting. It was a pre-scheduled meeting, but we started to get a hint that something was happening when we saw a last-minute agenda item added later in the morning. And what we saw, the council went into closed session. When they came out, they announced that they were unanimously approving, with the 13-0 vote, approving that $27 million settlement. I want you to listen to what we heard from city leaders just in the past couple of hours earlier this afternoon. Listen to what the mayor said.
And so today's settlement reflects our shared commitment to advancing racial justice, our sustained push for progress, our commitment to Minneapolis, and our commitment and compassion to one another. We need to be unrelenting We need to be unapologetic in our pursuit of a more equitable local government and a more just approach to community safety in our city, and we will be.
You see the mayor there joined by the family of George Floyd. The family allocated about $500,000 from that $27 million settlement for the community, that Chicago and 38th intersection. That was the area where George Floyd was killed. It's an area that still has flowers, still has commemorations, active commemorations for George Floyd. We just saw in the past couple of minutes his family walk over to that area, lay some flowers down, get on their knee, have a silent prayer. You get a sense that this is not so much a celebratory thing, but it's definitely a solemn part as this trial continues. And we just completed the first week of the trial of Derek Chauvin, the officer accused of killing George Floyd. Allison?
Yeah, Shaq, let's talk about that. Jury selection, week one, now done in the Derek Chauvin trial. Where do things stand this evening?
You're right, week one now done, and we have half of the jury seated, 7 members of the 14-panel jury and alternates that need to be seated by the end of this process. What do we know about the jurors? We know the majority of them are men. 5 are men, 2 are women. 1 woman, the second woman, was seated today. She is in her 50s. The other jurors, half of them are in their 20s. The others are in their 30s. We also are getting a sense of the racial makeup of this jury, which is something that, of course, is something that many people, not only in the community, but also the prosecution team is watching very closely. We know that the majority are white, but the other half, about 4 of them, are people of color. Or 3 of them are people of color. So this is something that we are going to continue to watch be developed over the course of this week. What we know is that court is out of session this weekend, but starting Monday, this jury selection process will continue. So we'll continue to watch it, Allison.
All right, Shaq, have a terrific weekend. In the meantime, we will check back in with you on Monday.
All right.
I love you, I love you, I love you. How long has it been since you could have touched me?
A reunion 1 year in the making.
Good thing we got to keep the mask on, because otherwise I'd be smooching all over your face.
Married for over 50 years, Kay and Orlin Wentz have spent the last year apart, stuck in separate nursing homes in Kearney, Nebraska, only able to chat by phone until this Monday, when Orlin surprised Kay with a visit.
I love you. I love you.
I love you too. A long overdue hug made possible because Kay and Orlin are now fully vaccinated.
I don't tear a lot, but I do tear inside. And that was just emotional.
I still can't believe I've seen him. And it's the first chance I've had to touch him in over a year. It's been way too long.
The couple hope they can soon get back together with their entire family, 5 children and more than 60 grand and great-grandchildren. Until then, Kay will settle for the love of her life.
I'm homesick for a small room where I can be with him. It's not the way I think of when I'm married to somebody for 53 years, sitting out here shivering to death. I'd like to see, and I'd like to have him hold me tight.
It's been a year defined by separation, seeing loved ones through glass or through a screen. Now, as more and more people get vaccinated, families are finally beginning to reunite. All year, Lindsay Hawkins would have given anything to see her grandparents in person. In the end, it was her job that made it possible. As a CVS pharmacist in Minnesota, she's been working extra hours as part of a vaccination team.
My grandpa actually asked me one day if I could be the one to give it to him.
She's now been giving vaccines to her own grandparents, getting them one step closer to the day she can finally hug them again.
Very emotional for me to be able to give my grandparents their shot, and yeah, it's really amazing.
Didn't even feel it.
Joking.
With millions of Americans getting vaccinated every single day, we're all one step closer to being together again after so much time apart.
Oh, I love you. I love you. I love you. I love you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.